Hey everybody, Greg here again. This is part two of talking about becoming an information security or cybersecurity consultant. In the previous episode, talked a little bit about finding out your why. I think that's the most important thing. You have to understand why you want to become a consultant. And it's not meaning that you have to have the right reasons, you just have to have the right reasons for you. The next step is critically important, and you can't skip this. You need to spend a lot of time on this. And this is doing a risk assessment or a couple of different types of risk assessments. Because becoming a consultant carries incredible risk, most importantly from the financial side. Now, I think about my particular situation when I decided to make the leap more than 5 years ago. My career, my entire adult life, in fact, and even before that, I've always had a job. In fact, I can probably say that since middle school, I think I've always had a job. Maybe there were some breaks in between, starting with a paper route, but I've always had something. And whenever I've left a job, particularly in full time, that I've left to go to another job. So I've never had a period of unemployment in, gosh, I guess it's been at least 33 years now of professional career, 34. And then prior to that, the part-time jobs that I had in college and this and that, I always had like, it seemed like in college, I always had at least two jobs going on at some point in time. Anyway, the reason why I bring that up is that for me, from a qualitative risk assessment perspective, I was always very comfortable about getting a paycheck. It's a safety net. It's a security blanket, if you will, no pun intended. Having somebody else pay me, knowing that every week or later on every 2 weeks or every month, depending upon your pay cycle, that you would have exactly this amount of money coming into your checking account is just so warm, I guess. It is secure. You know what's coming in, and therefore you can plan easily for what's coming out, what's going out. When you're a consultant, you don't know that. It can vary low one month, high another month, and so on and so forth. You also don't know if you're going to actually have work because another part of the qualitative risk assessment is assessing some of the skills that are needed. I'm not going to get into the details on that right now at this episode, but some of the skills that are needed beyond what you're doing right now as a cybersecurity professional, you have to learn how to run a business. You have to learn accounting, you have to learn marketing, you have to learn interviewing if you go down the path of actually bringing on people to work with you. And of course, you may have that experience from your current position, of course. But all that to say is that it's not just about the work itself. There's a whole different, there's taxes involved too, as I mentioned last time, and you have to learn about that. So that's the first part of the risk assessment. You have to understand the risk of needing to learn more stuff. And we'll talk more, like I said, in a later episode about the details of that stuff. But you have to at least assess that. Can you do that? Do you want to do that? Are you the type that needs structure from an 8 to 5 going into an office or even working from home? Or can you plan out your work day with little or no, it'd probably be close to no, external influence? You won't have a boss laying out at the very least the structure of what your position is. You have to figure that out all yourself. Yeah, assuming you're an independent consultant as opposed to a consultant that is working in that position for a large firm, because that almost is kind of like a job. What I'm talking about is becoming a strict 1099. You're on your own. You are independent. There are other risks involved too, and some of it is financial. Insurance, for example. What are you going to do for insurance? Now, in my particular case, with regards to insurance, that was a little bit easier because I had been on my wife's policy since the beginning of this. She works full time, and therefore it just became easier in that I had that path. But I was prepared to look at, if need be, going with independent insurance, and even to the point of doing that where I would have to bring my wife on in case, for whatever reason, she lost her position. So you have to think forward about that. You can't assume anything static. Again, you might even go so far, I did not do this, but you could actually create a risk register and put all these risks in, do your likelihood and impact. Look at your controls that you think you would have in place, and do you actually minimize the risk beyond your risk tolerance, which you have to define that yourself too. How much risk am I actually being able to take? Family time. There's going to be times when you're going to have to work hours that maybe you hadn't worked before. That might be a smaller risk in that you may have already been doing that, but that's another consideration. And then there's the quantitative risk side. Now, I am in no way advocating for doing a fair analysis on this factor of analysis of information risk. But you should at the very least lay out where you're at financially, not just currently, but also planning for retirement. Because I would assume that most folks considering going independent already have a retirement strategy in place. You've been saving for years, and you need to take a look at that and try to look forward 10, 15, 20, however many years it is to when you plan to retire. So if you're 45 and you plan to retire at 65, you need to, and you might have to get a financial advisor involved with this to really look at where you're at and what you need to keep going. They might tell you something along the lines of, well, in order to get to where you want to go, you're going to have to put aside $50,000 a year, $30,000 a year, whatever it might be at minimum. Maybe it's more, maybe it's less. If you don't have the skills to kind of figure that out yourself, you may want to get a financial advisor. Unless, of course, being prepared for retirement is not something that you're concerned with, but I think that probably just about everybody would be. There are probably other risks involved too that are more person dependent. There's the risk of, can I work from home? A lot of that might be mitigated right now because more likely than not, everybody who starts out as an independent consultant will start out at their house, because if they don't have a client base and don't have an income, it doesn't make any sense to go and rent an office. Now, as time went on, for me personally, let me tell a quick story about risk and where I actually miscalculated something. When I started, I had always loved the idea of working from home. It wouldn't be great like one day, maybe even 2 days a week, that you can avoid the commute and the headache of the rush hour traffic. My commute typically was between 35 and 45 minutes every day each way to and from Nashville, where I worked at the time. And the traffic would be traffic, you know, and it's stressful, and particularly if you're trying to get into work and you're thinking about the workday and this and that. For me, it seemed like a no-brainer. The risk of going to work from home is like, oh yeah, no, that's a risk of opportunity. I don't want to miss that opportunity. And so I started, and I did a fine job as far as managing my time, cut down the commute significantly. My commute was from my bedroom to my home office, so it took maybe about 20 seconds, which is great. Didn't really have to worry about getting dressed if I wasn't having any video calls. And remember, this is before COVID, so it isn't quite as, is loose the right word? It isn't quite as strict, as rigid as it was before. Like I would make sure that on every video call with a client or a prospect back then that I was pristine, ready to go. I may wear a tie and this and that. Now it's like everybody has kind of gotten into the realm of being more casual. But I digress. 6 months into doing that, working from home, I was starting to go stir crazy. I always think of myself as an introvert, But I realized that I'm actually more of an extrovert in some ways, that I need to have people around me. I need to have the control to be able to extract myself from people if need be, because sometimes I just get overwhelmed with it. But I do need people around me. I need to have that relationship. I also realized I needed a little bit more structure. It's great with the 20-second commute and your bedroom slippers, but I missed the idea of actually going into an office. And so I ended up getting a membership with a co-working firm like WeWork, but smaller, more local, called eSpaces. And I would go in a couple of times a week, grab a cube, and basically just sit there, and that was my office for the day. Well, as the business started to get better and started to bring in more clients and therefore more revenue, when an opportunity presented itself for a small office, I took it. And the reason why I took it is because I realized that actually going into an office with that structure made me more efficient. Even though now I had an actual commute to go somewhere, my commute is about 15 minutes nowadays. And it's light traffic, local traffic, not stressful. And then eventually, as the business continued to grow, needed more space, ended up getting a larger office, and here I am today. So the takeaway from that is that your assumptions when doing the risk assessment may change as you progress as a consultant. Don't be afraid to reassess your risks, and don't be afraid to change your direction. And one more thing, and maybe we'll talk more about this later, there's going to be the risk of making mistakes. You're going to try a lot of new things, particularly if you're like me and you're spinning up a business. You never really thought about being an entrepreneur, but there are whole hosts of things that you've never worked with before. One of them is going out and trying to get clients, and I found out very early on that I'm not only horrible with cold calling, I just don't like it, and I won't do it. I will not cold call anymore. I probably did maybe about 50 or 60 early on, and just not going to do it. You can't, if you're risk adverse to making mistakes, then maybe you shouldn't consider independent consulting. Maybe you should consider staying just in that safety net of the structure and the knowledge and the security of having a steady paycheck. But I wouldn't be afraid of making mistakes, because I've made a lot. But every time I've made a mistake, I know it's sort of like common to say this, but every time I've made a mistake, I've learned from it, I've grown from it, and I've become better. I think in the next episode, or one of the future episodes, we're going to talk a little bit more about mistakes. I'll talk a little bit about some of the mistakes I made. I already briefly mentioned one about cold calling. I'll probably get deeper into that. But we'll touch on that on the next segment of this. So I hope this is useful for you. And until next time, we'll see you then.